Welcome to the Practice Discipleship Training Initiative. My name is Dawn Troutman. I am from LutheranLifeCoach.com. This initiative is a dynamic partnership between the ELCA Youth Ministry Network, the ELCA Churchwide organization, and other ministries within the church. The goal of Practice Discipleship is to foster faithful, thoughtful, intentional leaders in congregations who follow Jesus in their daily lives. The theme for this year is Faith Formation in a Missional Age. This is the last in a series of 7 webinars that focus on Lutheran theology, ministry theory, and practical skills relating to our theme. So we're taking it home today with a webinar entitled Going Public. Our presenter is Dr. Jeremy Myers from Augsburg College. So please do pay attention, listen in. There is not a quiz, but we do have plenty of time for questions, clarifications. There are no bad questions. So since we have you all muted, which gives you a little freedom if there is some noise wherever you are, notice the box on the right side of your screen. That's where you can type in questions and comments, and I will keep an eye on that box and repeat them so that Jeremy can answer all of your questions, and we will get to as many as we possibly can. So let's get to it. Welcome, Jeremy.
Hello, Dawn. Thanks.
Yes, how are you?
I'm doing well. And you?
I am doing well. I'm excited for this, going public.
I am too. I get more and more excited about talking about this idea each time I do it. So I'm looking forward to this today very much. Yes.
Good. Well, let's jump in so we can get to a lot of questions.
Sure thing. Christ is risen.
He is risen indeed. Hallelujah.
And I'm assuming everyone else out there is saying the same thing. And that's really the whole purpose of this session today, this Going Public session, is to help congregations seek out and proclaim that resurrection out in the public square. That's the whole purpose of today's session, is to really seek out and proclaim resurrection. My plan for this session is to talk at you for about 20 minutes and explain this idea to you. And then at the end of the 20 minutes, we'll have a time for question and comments. I'll pause at different points throughout the webinar to give you a moment or two to reflect on some of the things that have been said. If you find yourself wanting me to clarify an idea I've been talking about before I move on, then please feel free to submit a question to Dawn right away with lots of exclamation points so that she knows that she should interrupt me, and I'll be happy to pause and take that question. But for the most part, maybe we'll try and hold questions to the end unless they're really urgent. I'm happy to pause in that case. Okay?
Great.
So this whole idea behind going public involves local congregations finding creative ways to discern and proclaim Christ's work in their communities, in their neighborhoods, or in their context. A congregation that's doing this work of going public will actually be invested in this process, and they'll actually see that process of going public, of looking for and proclaiming Christ's work in the world. They'll see that process as faith formation. They'll see that process of discerning and proclaiming Christ's work out in the public square as the primary way in which we form faith today. So that's the whole idea behind going public. But let's start by talking about the problem that we face as a church. David Kinnaman works with the Barna Group, which is an organization that's committed to researching the intersection between faith and culture. You've probably read some of their research in the past. And in his recent book, which is called You Lost Me, it's referenced there at the bottom. In his recent book called You Lost Me, he illustrates some reasons why young people, young adults, are leaving the church today. And he identifies 3 key weaknesses in the church's approach to discipleship with young people. So I want to go over those with you real quickly. The first weakness really is in the area of relationships. So young people are leaving our congregations when they when they find themselves not connected relationally to enough other people in the congregation. So that's one weakness that he hears young people talking about, relationships, that they don't have enough meaningful relationships in the congregation to stay involved. The second weakness, which he hears young people talking about, is vocation. Our young people are leaving our congregations when we don't help them understand how to live out their faith in their daily lives, in their daily work, in their families. We're not helping them understand what difference faith makes in their daily life. And the third weakness that Kinnaman heard these young people talk about was in the area of wisdom. Wisdom is the thing that connects knowledge and practice. So what Kinnaman is saying is that, or what the young adults were telling Kinnaman, is that our congregations do a pretty good job at teaching knowledge, and maybe our congregations do a pretty good job of creating experiences, but our congregations are not doing a very good job of connecting knowledge and experience. So we're not teaching young people how to use knowledge to better understand their experience. We're not teaching them how to use the biblical narrative to understand their experience, and we're not teaching them how to tap into their experience to better understand the knowledge that we're teaching. So these are the three key weaknesses that Kinnaman has heard young people talk about, young people who have left the church. And if we're going to change, if we're going to really solve this problem, then we really have to be thinking about new ways of approaching faith formation that take these three critiques seriously. And it's my hope that the public church, or this going public idea, really does that. I think these three critiques that we just looked at are the result of decades of discipleship practices that have been based on a false assumption. And the false assumption is that faith is primarily private. See, ever since the scientific revolution of the Enlightenment, faith has gotten pushed further and further into just the private sphere of life. So over time, faith has become sort of a nice thing that you do on your own in private. Your personal faith beliefs are fine as long as they remain private, but they should not ever they're not used in the public square as a way of thinking about life and making decisions for our community. Over the last few hundred years, faith has become thought of as primarily private. We as a church have bought into that myth, and in turn, we've done decades now of faith formation and discipleship based on this myth of a private faith. And unfortunately, what it's done is we've passed along a faith that really only holds up in the private sphere. It doesn't really have much power out in the public sphere. So again, if we're going to do something different, we have to figure out how to do this, do faith formation in the public square. So faith formation in a missional age is really going to have to be public. In order to address the concerns that Kinnaman pointed out, and in order to counter this myth of private faith, we have to start thinking about faith formation as a public act, not a private act. And faith formation this faith formation in the missional age will be public when congregations or intergenerational faith communities begin to discern and proclaim Christ's presence and activity and their proper response. So those two things, Christ's work and our response. When we start discerning Christ's work and our response out in the public square for the common good, then we will be doing missional faith formation in a missional age out in the public square. Faith communities that are doing this will be forming faith in new and vibrant ways that I think will start to address some of these critiques that we just looked at. And there are, I would say there are 5 art forms. The truth is there's probably more, but right now we're talking about 5 art forms that faith communities might engage in order to move their faith formation practices out into the public. And let me say a word about art forms, because I chose this word intentionally. By art form, I mean a practice that will look different when led by different people in different places. So if you were a sculptor, I'm pointing at my computer screen now, assuming that I'm pointing at you. If you're a sculptor and I'm a sculptor, you might work with clay, and your goal might be a realistic representation of what you want to make. I might work with garbage that I pull out of the Mississippi River, and my goal might be more of an abstract representation. But you hopefully would still consider my work art, and I would consider your work art, and you would consider me a sculptor, and I would consider you a sculptor. So we share an art form. We're both sculptors, but your process of sculpting would be very different than my process, and your end product would be very different than my end product. So that's what I mean by an art form. So the first one that's listed here, accompaniment. This is something we must all be doing no matter who we are, no matter where we are doing ministry. Accompaniment is something we all must be doing. But your process of accompaniment will look different than someone else's process. Your end product will look different than someone else's end product. So my goal here is not to tell you how to practice accompaniment. My goal here is to explain to you what accompaniment is, and to hopefully get you and your faith community starting to think about how we practice this. Okay, so that's what I mean by art forms. So let me quickly just list these off, and then we'll move, and then I'll take some time to explain each one. So first one, accompaniment. The second art form is biblical imagination. The next art form is discernment, and then after that we have reflective practice and ritualization. So now we're going to go through each one of these 5 art forms. I want to explain it and then give you a moment to just sort of pause and reflect on how you might be practicing this art form in your community. So the first art form is accompaniment. And the art form of accompaniment actually happens when congregations start to intentionally engage their context, their community, their neighborhood, in order to better know and better serve that group of people. So accompaniment, rather than us just turning on the lights and unlocking the door and hoping people show up, accompaniment is the process of going out into our communities and listening to our communities. It happens when we intentionally take on this posture and this spirit of listener before we actually start to speak. If we truly want to proclaim good news to our neighbors, then we must first take the time to hear and understand what their bad news is. Accompaniment is that process. It's that process of hearing the bad news. And by engaging in accompaniment with our young people, we start to teach them how to love their neighbors and how to see Christ at work in their neighbors. So accompaniment is being proactive about going out into our communities to truly hear the bad news and to truly see the good news, the assets that are out there, in order to better understand how our congregations might be in relationship with the context in which our congregation is planted. So what I'd like to do now is, and this might be awkward, I don't know, I've never done this in a webinar, but I'm just going to give you, a minute, like 1 minute for you guys to spend some time reflecting on accompaniment in your setting. If you're participating in this webinar with a group of people, then maybe you'll want to just discuss it briefly. If you're doing this on your own, then maybe you just want to take some time to start writing, making a list, just jotting down ideas. No idea is a bad idea right now. The assumption is that you'll spend more time later working on these ideas. But right now, just take a moment and think about how your congregation might start to practice this art form of accompaniment. engaging your whole congregation intergenerationally in the process of listening to your community. So I'll give you about a minute, and then we'll move on to the next art form, okay?
And Jeremy, can we get some ideas from the listeners right now
that's great. That's
that
great.
I'll share at the end of the minute?
That's great. I trust your lead on that, Dawn.
So those of you listening live, please put something into the box and we'll share it. And that could be very helpful, actually. No bad answers, and also then you're giving more ideas to the other people listening. So thank you, and we'll take a minute, and during that minute, if whatever ideas you have, put them in the box, and I'll share them whenever Jeremy says we're coming back together.
Okay, so that was about a minute, and like I said, I hope you'll take some more time, you know, in the next few days or weeks to think more about these. But right now, we're just trying to plant the seed of these ideas and start to think about what they might look like in your setting. So I don't know, Don, did anyone share any ideas?
We do have Mary Kay. Thank you for jumping in and taking the lead. She says, taking a walk around the neighborhood with a group of folks and imagining from what we see the common struggles and joys might be.
Great idea.
Thank you. Yeah, just the walking around and really taking it in. Thank you, Mary Kay. So let's move on. And Mary Kay, you can jump into all of them, or others can jump in as well. But let's hear the next one in biblical imagination. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so the next art form is biblical imagination. And you'll start to see how each art form grows out of the previous one. So this art of biblical imagination happens when congregations begin to interpret their experiences through the lens of the biblical narrative. So basically what we're saying is that we don't just learn Bible stories, but we actually learn how to use the biblical narrative. So the Bible's story of redemption and hope starts to shape the way that we interpret what we hear as we listen and accompany our neighbor. So the Bible starts, our understanding of the biblical narrative starts to shape the way we interpret what we hear from our community. It gives us a certain sense of hope. It might also give us a certain sense of anger about some of the things that we see in the community, but we actually are using the biblical narrative to understand what we're experiencing. And by practicing this with our young people, we actually start to teach them how to interpret Scripture through their own life experiences, but we also teach them how to interpret life through the Scripture. And they also then start to learn that God's Word is not just this book that was compiled so long ago, but that it's a living, breathing thing that's alive and active and full of meaning today, for their lives today. So biblical imagination is taking the biblical narrative and using it as a lens, like this young woman with her fingers, you know, kind of framing the picture. The biblical narrative becomes a framework for the way we think about our lives in community, in the public. So again, let's just take a moment. I'll give you about a minute, and just start thinking about how your faith community, how your congregation might start to practice the art of biblical imagination with families, with young people, with children, with youth, with old people, intergenerationally. How would we begin to practice this art form of biblical imagination?
As we start that, I want to give the other examples. There's always this fun, delightful delay in some of the answers, and it's the technology, not the people. So don't worry. But there are some other examples about accompaniment that actually, as you said, can feed nicely into biblical imagination. So Mary Kay also said inviting neighbors into their building for something and then letting those people know they really want to hear from them. It's not just a rented room. Barb said she's from New Jersey, and her congregation used to have a hot sit-down meal once a month for families that received food from their town's food bank. It worked out well, but once the congregation got so small, they were not able to have the manpower to continue the mission, but it was nice to take time and share a meal with the community members that they didn't necessarily know until then. Another person said a group from Minneapolis did a teen homelessness march to the Capitol and had Bible study and listening sessions around the issues of youth homelessness. And then Myrna said it is fun to role play scripture, so that's probably moving on to the biblical imagination. Thank you for kicking us off, Myrna. So we'll have our time to kind of think, and everybody do write in, and we'll catch up our technology and move on.
Great, thanks, Dawn. So let's take a minute now to think about biblical imagination in our settings. All right. I'd love to hear any ideas that might have come in.
So far, just Myrna, but I have reason to believe others are thinking about it.
I'm sure they are.
Yeah, and actually Mary Kay is writing. No, we're vamping. What do they do on NPR when this happens? So Mary Kay wrote, ask youth, adults, or children, perhaps in the children's message, what they see in their schools and neighborhoods regarding bad news, for example, asking who they might see meeting a good Samaritan. Thank you, Mary Kay.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of making that jump from the story to real life.
A great, a great resource that I would mention for this art form would be a book called God in the Graffiti by Frank Rogers, who teaches out at Claremont School of Theology. And in this book, again, it's called God in the Graffiti by Frank Rogers, Mr. Rogers. Not the Mr. Rogers, but
not
a
Fred,
Mr. Rogers.
But Frank.
Right. And but he talks about using theater exercises, drama, to not only teach young people the biblical stories, but to also get them to start to think about how that biblical story might be told in their time, but also to think about how that biblical story might be proclaiming freedom or liberation or resurrection in their time. So he does make, it's not just about telling the story, it's also about, he does make the theological move. He helps kids think about the theological truth claim in that narrative and what it might look like in their setting today. So I recommend that resource for this art form. Mm-hmm.
And that might be something either Myrna did write. It's fun to role play scripture, so maybe you have that book already, Myrna, or it might be a good resource for you. And Lisa wrote, it seems like the story of the prodigal son would be a really good one to talk about with real life situations. Thank you, Lisa. So that's it for now, but do keep writing in as we move forward.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, let's move on to the next art form, which is discernment. And discernment, all of these art forms are intended to be practiced in a community, in an intergenerational community, particularly discernment. This is meant to be a communal art. It's a communal art of seeking to understand God's call or invitation in any particular situation. So this art form of discernment happens when God's people answer two questions. Okay, the first question is, where is God in this situation? And the second question is, what is God calling us to do or be in this situation? The art forms of accompaniment and biblical imagination, you can see those naturally lead to these questions. And therefore, they naturally lead to the art form of discernment. So again, you're starting to see how these flow from one into the next. When we engage our young people in this practice of discerning Christ's presence and our call out in the public square, we're actually teaching them how to do the same thing in their daily lives. So as a community of faith, as a congregation, an intergenerational faith community, as we start to ask ourselves, what is God up to here? And as we start to ask ourselves, what are we being called to do here? Then we're actually teaching our young people and our old people, we're teaching everyone in the community, how to do that in their own lives. So then when something happens in a young person's school, that young person might pause and ask themselves, what is God doing here? And what is God calling me to do? Where is Christ at in this situation? And how is Christ calling me to participate with him in his work here? So by engaging in this process of discernment as a faith community, we actually start to teach our young people how to do this in their own daily lives. And they'll start to see how God is at work in their daily life, and they'll start to learn how to respond to God's work in their daily life. So again, let's just take a minute now, and we'll pause. This will be the last art form that we'll pause on. The other two I'm just going to talk through.
Okay.
But let's pause. I'd love to hear some ideas about how you guys are practicing discernment, or how you would love to practice discernment with your congregation and your community. So let's just take a minute now for that one. Okay, and I'll interrupt. This is so weird to do when you can't hear if people are talking. You don't know what's going on. But I'll interrupt and see if any people have any ideas on discernment.
Yes, Chris wrote that they are doing this as a congregation. They're looking at what faith formation or lifelong learning should look like in the entire setting, and it is an important step to do as a congregation. And he also liked the way you made that connection with, if we all are discerning as a congregation, people are learning how to do that as an individual in their own life. Mary Kay wrote, at a middle school lock-in, they did a guided visualization, school hour by school hour. Interesting. And where are you? What's happening? Who around you might need prayer? And then we prayed for the folks anonymously, 6 minutes of popcorn prayer with middle school voices. Priceless. Cool. And Lisa wrote, I love doing this on lunch breaks, these two questions that you put out, the questions, where is God in the situation, and what is God calling us to do in the situation. So Lisa does that on lunch breaks when we are on Servant Week projects in their community. So she wrote, great discussion starters, no reason to wait until the work is done to talk about it, because they're doing it at lunch. That's great.
That's great experiential education practice, and it's also teaching your kids how to think theologically about what's happening around them. That's wonderful.
Yeah, and then that is something that can go back to their schools with them too, not just on the projects.
Right.
And then Myrna wrote, the acting out situations of what would Jesus do if is a great way to do situational events. So thank you all for jumping in.
Yeah, the thing I love about discernment, you know, pardon me, the discernment, it's not just the planning, it's not just planning ministry. Discernment is not just something you do in the youth committee, but it's really this theological process of wondering out loud with a community of people about what God might be doing, and then wondering out loud with a community of people what our response should be. So it's not just going into a committee room and mapping out a year of programming for your youth ministry, but it's doing the hard work of a community to try and understand what God's doing, which is really, really, really exciting.
Yeah.
And in the process of doing that, we're teaching people, essentially we're teaching people discipleship. We're teaching them the process of following Christ. So this art form is really important to me, obviously, and I'll recommend another resource here. There's a book called Practicing Discernment with Youth. I'm hoping that's a pretty easy title to remember. Practicing Discernment with Youth, and it's by a man named David White. Great book for this art form.
Like the color.
Like the color, exactly like the color.
All right. There's a Y, oddly.
So now we'll move to the next art form, which is reflective practice. This nice little spiral or spring. And this art form is kind of the thread that pulls all the previous art forms together. And this is the process, essentially it's a process of learning from our experiences. And you can see on this image here in front of you how the spiral of reflection moves upward from experience through interpretation, through discernment, and into action for transformation, which becomes essentially a new experience that then demands interpretation and discernment again. So you can see how it becomes cyclical, right, as you move through this. So this process involves the listening that comes from the art form of accompaniment, and it also involves the interpretation that comes from our biblical imagination. So the point is that we live life as a community of faith out in the public square. Most of our lives are lived away from church, but we don't spend much time helping people understand how to live a Christian life away from church. So we live life as a community of faith spread out in the public square, seeking to interpret and understand our life experiences and seeking to respond to those experiences faithfully. By practicing this art form, we're actually starting to teach our young people, like I just said a little while ago, we're teaching them discipleship on the fly as life is lived out. We're teaching them how to understand life and how to live life as people of faith. Out of our collective and individual experiences, we seek to notice God's revelation, and we seek to respond to that revelation collectively and individually, but never privately. We always do it publicly. So this in turn then creates a new experience, which we kind of went through at the beginning. It creates a new experience which demands new interpretation and new discernment and new action. And the thing I want to point out here, if you're familiar with experiential education, this is the experiential education cycle. If you're familiar with practical theology, this is the practical theology cycle. But it's basically a cycle that moves from action to reflection to action to reflection to action to reflection. But the difference is, and I add this from Paulo Freire, who wrote a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Paulo Freire claims that the action that we have an experience, we go through the interpretation and the discernment process, which leads to action, and the action should always be action for transformation. We should always be seeking to act in ways that transform society for the good of our neighbor.
And can you spell Frary? Do you have the book there? Sorry.
Yeah, it's F-R, and it's F-R-E-I-R-E, or it's F-R-I-E-R-E. Okay. I know that much.
Okay, one of those two in Amazon.com.
Yeah, there you go. Paulo Freire.
Thank you.
And then we'll move on to the last art form, and then I'm excited to hear more comments and questions. So you can see how all these art forms are building on one another, and they kind of move towards this one thing, and that's ritualization, public ritualization. And there's a great story, well, there's many great stories in the Bible, but the one I want to mention here is at the beginning of Joshua. The Israelites are crossing the Jordan River into the Promised Land, and as they're crossing the river, God commands one member of each tribe of Israel to pick up a stone out of the river, and they carry these stones across, and they pile them up on one another on the banks of the Jordan when they cross into the Promised Land. And God tells them to do this so that when their children are playing down by the river, the children will see the stones, and the children will ask their parents and their grandparents, what's up with the stones? Why do we have this pile of stones down here? And once the kids ask those questions, then the parents and the grandparents will have to tell them the stories of God's promises and how God remained faithful to them and how they came into this land. So it is this process. That's why we're looking at a pile of stones in front of us right now. That process is the process of marking a particular place and a particular time as holy. So my question is, where are these pile of stones in your community? And what role has the church played in piling up those stones? See, the art form of ritualization is the process of marking these times, marking different times and marking different places as sacred or holy for our communities. For example, let me give you some examples. For example, a congregation that's located across the street from an elementary school builds a memorial for a student who was hit by a car and killed as he was biking home from school one day. Or a congregation and a local theater company partner together in a public reenactment and processional of Las Posadas at Christmas time. A congregation on Good Friday carries a cross around its neighborhood, stopping and praying for resurrection at significant spots within the neighborhood. See, by taking the time to mark time and place as holy with our young people, we start to teach them. We don't just teach them, but we're actually proclaiming a truth that God is at work, that God is doing something here in this place at this time, or that we believe God did do something here in this place at this time. And we mark it as sacred, we mark it as holy, and we do that with our young people, and in doing that, we're making a bold claim that God is still at work, and in doing that, we're actually teaching our young people how to worship God out in the public square.
Wonderful.
So we can move on to
Lisa wants the 2 questions repeated, and Lisa, please correct me if I'm wrong. Is it the 2 questions perhaps that God's people are answering? When earlier you were saying in discernment God's people are answering 2 main questions?
Sure. I'll take a shot, and Lisa, you tell us if I'm right or wrong. Okay?
Yeah.
I believe that what you're referring to would be the 2 questions. One, what is God doing in this situation? What is Christ up to in our location? What do we believe that God is doing right now here in this place? That's kind of the first question. And the second question is, how should we respond? So what is Christ doing here in this? What is Christ doing in our community? And the second question is, how is Christ inviting us to participate with him in his work in our community? Did we get it? Are those?
Yes, she did right, that you're right. And that actually, I love that she asked that, because it really relates to the funnel on the previous slide. You're saying
Absolutely.
exactly the same things in 2 steps instead of 4.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So
moving on.
Yeah, we'll move on to the last slide, and then we'll take some questions. You can start to see how all these art forms feed into one another and kind of work together in a cyclical way. But as we engage in these art forms with our young people, we actually start to engage in a new form of faith formation or discipleship, which I think is really faith formation in a missional age. We form faith by being missional, and we're missional by being out in the world looking for God at work in the world. So we don't form faith in order to be missional. We form faith as we are missional, as we are out in the world looking for Christ's work. We'll be teaching them how to do this work. Yeah, I'm going to stop. I think I'm just going to stop talking so that you guys can get your questions and comments in. But this is a whole lot of stuff. It's a whole lot of big ideas. And it's kind of a strange format to present it in, so I hope it made some sense for you. I hope it stimulated some good thinking. I'm eager to field some questions and hear your comments now too. So thanks for playing along. What do you got to say?
And as people are writing in your questions, my eyes are glued to the box, and I will definitely repeat your questions to Jeremy. I'd love to, do you have any stories, Jeremy, of how this has gone well in a congregation you are familiar with or involved in, just to get people started?
Well, I'm still looking for those stories, honestly.
Okay.
I hear small stories here and there of some pretty amazing things, but I haven't heard stories of congregations that have really taken this on systematically as a formal approach to faith formation. Some of the comments that some of the examples I gave when I talked about ritualization are pretty powerful. Where a congregation sort of stepped up and responded, in the moment. But we're still looking for those stories.
I love it. We're cutting edge. The people listening, one of your congregations can be giving us the story.
Yeah. We're either cutting edge or we're totally wrong. I don't know.
I love it. Go big or go home, right?
Yeah, right.
For me, I love the shift of you calling it an art form because it says there is not a specific set of skills and you learn the information and you're done. You're ready.
Mm-hmm.
So
no, yeah, and that's why, this is supposed to be a more hands-on practical webinar, but I honestly can't teach you how to go about the practice of accompaniment in your location, really, and this is why, because the work of discipleship is an intergenerational community of faith coming together and figuring that out. If I just gave you a manual on how to do it in your location, then it would be a program. But right. what I'm talking about is a community of faith figuring out how to do these things, and the process of figuring them out, that process is actually the process of faith formation. Young people then in that process are learning how to live as active disciples of Christ.
Wonderful. Ian wrote they're planning to use the book Discovering Hope to begin this process in their setting. I don't know if you're familiar with that book.
I am not. Who's the author? Anne, did you say who the author was?
The person who wrote it is named Ian. And Ian, if you would like to give us the author, we all may benefit from whatever that book is, Discovering Hope. So it sounds like there are some settings that are starting to look at doing things this way.
And I would say I've heard many stories of settings and congregations that are starting to think this way, and that's really exciting. But we just don't we don't have any I don't have any perfect examples, which is okay.
Right. So this is something maybe that's layering on top of the programs that we're all aware of.
Yeah, I would say every congregation out there is doing bits and pieces of this. None of, the example I gave of sculpting, you know, I talked about found art, pulling junk out of the river and making something out of it. That's basically what this idea is. It's a bunch of other, uh, um, bunch of fragments of other things that we're pulling together. Accompaniment is a whole nother idea that has a life of its own. Same with discernment. But when you pull accompaniment together with discernment, both of them become even more powerful.
Yes, the process. And Ian, thank you for getting back to us. So the book he mentioned was called Discovering Hope, and there are two authors, David Pauling Goldine, so Polling-Goldene, and L. Shannon Young, so Shannon traditional spelling and Young, J-U-N-G, Augsburg Publishing, 2001. I think Ian might have this book nearby, so thank you. To even know the year of publication was helpful.
Thank you, Ian.
Yeah. Good. So, yeah, how does it happen? And anyone who has little bits and pieces of this, please do share your stories. Someone else wrote the beginning of the webinar, reminded them of Anthony Robinson's books, Transforming Congregational Culture.
Yep.
Are you familiar with that one?
Another good example, yep.
Great. Now we're in a book club. It's kind of fun. So for those of you who missed it when I said it, Transforming Congregational Culture by Anthony Robinson, R-O-B-I-N-S-O-N. So are there particular resources you know of, Jeremy, maybe not even a book, just about the accompaniment part of it, the discernment part of it, as people are kind of exploring how to put this entire process in place? The steps.
Well, for the accompaniment piece, I would highly recommend Rosella's webinar, Rosella White's webinar on accompaniment, and the ELCA Global Missions. They really get the whole concept of accompaniment, and they talk about it within the context of global missions. But a lot of their global mission events now, well, they call them glocal events. So they've kind of shifted from thinking only about global missions to thinking about local missions as well. And so the ELCA Office of Global Missions, they get this whole idea of accompaniment, I would say, better than anyone else right now. So I would recommend either trying to get to a global event or just browsing through the Global Missions website, learning more about accompaniment from them. Discernment, I highly recommend David White's book, and then also Mark Iaconelli's work on contemplative youth ministry. The whole idea behind Iaconelli's contemplative youth ministry project was discernment. How do we help young people listen for and discern the movement of the Spirit in their lives? And so that's what we're talking about now. But the difference is, how do we help young people discern the movement of the Spirit in their lives for the sake of the common good out in the public square? How do we help them hear God's call to them to love and serve their neighbor near and far?
Wonderful. And Lisa J., I have a few comments, but relating to what you're saying at this moment, Lisa J. Says the Global Missions has little 6 to 8 minute snippets on their website that are great, so look those up.
Great, thanks, Lisa.
Yeah, and those of you we were talking, Ian had said the book Discovering Hope. He said it's especially good for rural congregations. Great. So take a look at that, as anyone, but especially if you are rural or in a smaller setting. Lisa wrote about Grace in Action in Southwest Detroit as an example. This is a ministry, not a book. They are doing, I'm sorry, just jumped around. They are doing some amazing work in their neighborhoods, and they don't have an actual church building, but use garages in local neighborhoods to create space for creative engagement. How great is that?
Interesting.
Yeah, and then Lisa, go ahead.
I was going to say I've seen signs of this mostly and in urban and rural congregations, but I don't think it's an urban thing or a rural thing. I think it's the reality of trying to be church in a missional age where church is no longer really the norm.
Right.
And so I don't think we're talking about just urban ministry or rural ministry. I think we're actually challenging churches in every context to seek out ways of doing faith formation out in the context.
Right, and it might be the suburban mall because that's where people are.
Absolutely. So you're helping them understand God's work in that location. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Lisa Kay wrote, it strikes me these 5 art forms have nothing to do with programs or activities. It's like a slow movement, not like we have to be in slow motion, but these art forms cause us to slow down and be reflective and take time to talk and listen. That's really wonderful. Thank you. So thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. It's absolutely not about implementing a program. It's about guiding a community through a process of wondering about what God's doing and wondering how that community might respond.
Wonderful. And Josh has a question for you, Jeremy. He wrote, I am starting a young adult community in Toledo, Ohio. The young adults will be doing a faith walk around Toledo at the beginning of their 9 months here while they are reflecting on Luther's understanding of freedom and Freire's understanding of liberation. So the author you brought up. How do these 2 themes connect in your mind, and how could they be part of a faith walk practice?
Ooh.
Josh, bringing it home.
Thanks, Josh. You know, so now you're going to have, okay, I have 2 questions. 1, repeat the question. And 2, while she's repeating the question, Josh, type in the name of your organization because my mind is blanking on it, and that's one we should know about in this conversation.
Good. So Josh, please do respond. And so Josh has the young adult community in Toledo. They'll be doing a faith walk around Toledo at the beginning of their 9 months, reflecting on 2 things: Luther's understanding of freedom and Freire's understanding of liberation. So how do those 2 themes connect in your mind, and how could they be part of a faith walk practice? And it's called the Living Learning Ministry. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, that's great. While you were reading the question the first time, I was trying to remember the name of Josh's organization, so because I wanted to mention it. But yeah, I think this is perfect. Luther's understanding of freedom essentially says that freedom is really found in responsibility for the neighbor. Freedom is, and the neighbor understood broadly, so my next door neighbor, my distant neighbor, and even the watershed in which I live. So freedom is found in, true freedom is found in responsibility, which goes hand in hand. I love this connection with Freire's understanding of liberation, that liberation is really about empowerment and social change and improving the lives of everyone, particularly those who are oppressed. So both of these, both of those are alternative scripts or counter scripts, to use Walter Brueggemann's language, to our dominant script. The dominant way in which we think about freedom is, freedom from responsibility, and what Luther and Freire are saying is that true freedom really is found in responsibility, in relationship, in community.
Thank you. And if anyone else wants to look into that ministry, it's www.living-learning.net, living-learning.net.
Josh has created this really innovative gap year for post-high school, college-age young adults who are really looking to live in Christian community in new ways. For some of you, it might sound similar to Lutheran Volunteer Corps, but it's also different, and it's very much in line with some of the stuff that we were talking about today. So Josh, I'm glad you're here and that you spoke up, because that would actually be a pretty good example of some of this stuff.
That's something, to look into later for examples that can be helpful to others in other settings. Wonderful. So there are about 5 minutes left. If anyone else does have a question, we can get to it, but I'm also going to make sure, Jeremy, did you have any closing statements? I don't want to miss that.
Well, I always feel bad when I don't give someone something tangible that they can go and do. especially in a session that's supposed to be, one of the practical sessions.
Right.
But it's because I really believe that the tangible, practical thing you can do is go to your, gather a group of young people and adults together, explain to them what accompaniment means, and start trying to figure out how you can practice it. And in the process of figuring that out, we're actually doing faith formation. That's not a business meeting. That is faith formation.
Wonderful. And that meeting, you could actually play Rosella's accompaniment webinar. You could actually play Jeremy's webinar, whatever. Use these resources.
Yeah, I thank you for listening to me. I hope it's helpful. You can always track me down via email. You can find me on Augsburg College's website. If you have more questions for me, feel free to track me down. If you have stories of how this is working, I would love to hear those stories. We're really working on trying to compile some more concrete examples. Yeah.
Wonderful. And Lisa J. wrote a thank you, so you're very welcome, Lisa, and we're glad you are here and everybody's here. One good question from Mary Kay. They've all been great questions. Mary Kay anticipates this question from the parents, but what are you doing? So what can she say?
What do you do? Yeah, well, that's another, another step in this is really formulating, as a leader, taking time to formulate your elevator speech, taking time to formulate your explanation of what it is you're actually doing. And of course, I would say, invite those parents to come along with you. Invite them to be there with you, to start thinking about this as well. And really, when you have the chance to sit down with a person, a young person, an adult, whoever it might be, and you start to tell them what you're doing, you start to say, as a community, we're trying to understand what God's doing in our lives, and we're trying to seek an appropriate way to respond to that. We're trying to find the bad news and proclaim the good news in our lives. The truth is, I don't think there's a person out there who wouldn't want to be a part of that.
To be in the conversation.
To be a part of a community that's seeking to have a deeper understanding of what God is doing in the world, and I don't think anyone would disagree with that. I think many this is okay. Mary Kay, I think the source of that question, to kind of reference back to the presentation, the webinar, the source of that question is the assumption that faith is primarily private. And so then if faith is primarily private, then faith can be taught through a bunch of programs. And so then the parent wants to know what the program is that's addressing this, informing this faith, or teaching this faith. And it's not private, it's public. It's something we do together on the fly as we live our lives. And so some of it is just helping people, some of our work has to be helping people recognize the need for a paradigm shift from thinking about faith as private to thinking about faith as public.
Thank you. And Mary Kay writes, she's working on a Build Your Own mission trip to engage some youth in some of this, and she's with you, but it's a hard sell. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would even, build. I mean, I don't know how you're doing it, Mary Kay. I hope I get to hear how you're doing it. But I guess my question would be: are the parents and the young people involved from the beginning? Are they involved right at the get-go with discerning, what their call is? Or because that might make the sell a little easier if they're involved in the discernment process right from the beginning. Then they might buy in.
Right, the entire process. Yes, thank you. So we do need to wrap it up. These have gone in a lot of directions, and Myrna just wrote, thank you, I hope you do more of these. Faith is alive and should be acted out. I agree, Myrna. So this isn't the last of this series, but there are the past ones. There is hope for the future. I'm not in a position to make any sort of official announcements about that, but thanks for your vote there about these need to keep happening. So thank you, Jeremy, for being with us.
You're welcome. Thanks, Dawn. You do such a great job facilitating these.
Oh, thank you. I have a lot of fun with it. So
Good.
Thank you for being a great guest, too.
Mm-hmm.
So just quick reminders before we sign off. We invite you to visit Practice Discipleship. That's the website where you can find all of these things we've been referring to. So it's practicediscipleship.org. That's where you can view this and other archived webinars. You can download curriculum and videos from last year's theme, Opportunity or Despair, Youth Ministry at the Crossroads. You also can find live local Practice Discipleship events. So each synod in the ELCA has a Practice Discipleship coach who's been trained to offer seminars on these webinars locally in your own synod. So training events are posted on that website, practicediscipleship.org. So check back for updates. New ones do get posted all the time. Also, there is a network app. This is a part of the ELCA Youth Ministry Network, and you can have an app that gives you anytime access to the videos, network news, the calendar of events, the interactive prayer wall, and much more. You may be surprised at how much this app does. I was very impressed with it. So download that. It's free. You can just search ELCA in the App Store to find it. You're also invited to join us next third Tuesday conversation. It's on April 16th at 1 p.m. Central with Mark DeVries on the topic Sustainable Youth Ministry. So thank you again for joining us, and thanks again, Jeremy.
You're welcome. Thank you, Dawn. Thanks, everyone, for participating.
Yes. Thank you all, and we will talk to you again somewhere in some format. Goodbye.